Hello and welcome to the New Yorker Festival. I'm Atul Gawande. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker, and I welcome you for the chance to talk about this obscure topic of failure and rescue. A couple pieces of housekeeping. If you could make sure to turn off all cell phones. Photography is not allowed. And click, of course. I heard. And then if you are tweeting, feel free to use the TNYFest hashtag. The chance to talk to you today about failure and rescue stems out of a story that started for me as a case that involved some of my colleagues earlier this year. And it's a case that has stuck in my head because it had a variety of lessons in it that I think were interesting to try to ponder as we try to understand a variety of things that are happening, not just in healthcare, but well beyond. But maybe it's a lesson that comes out of healthcare. Mrs. C was 87 years old. She was a German Holocaust survivor. She had been in she came to our emergency room with a sudden loss of vision in her left eye. And it tells you a little something about her, that this sudden loss of vision happened while she was at work. Since she was 87 years old. She was working in the finance department at Sears. She'd worked her entire life. And when she was just a girl growing up in Germany, it had been in the 1930s, and she ended up having to leave Nazi Germany, just narrowly avoiding admission to the concentration camps. But they ended up among 20,000 Jewish refugees who were relocated to the Shanghai ghetto in Japanese-occupied China. She spent her teenage years there. She was there 8 years, helping her family just to live and survive. Food was hard to come by. Education was simply not in existence except for what they could organize themselves. And so there she lived until liberation in September 1945. Denied a formal education, she became a seamstress on admission to the United States, where she got to settle and live. She rose to become the head seamstress at Bloomingdale's in Chestnut Hill, right in my little town, outside Newton, Massachusetts, outside Boston. She married at 23 years of age. She had 2 sons along the way, but they became widowed at 44. Her husband had not been healthy. She herself, however, had been in great health. At 87, she lived independently in a second-floor apartment in Norwood, Massachusetts. She drove a Honda Civic to and from work, did her own shopping and own cooking. She worked 3.5 days a week at Sears in the finance department, doing primarily clerical and office work. The other days, she felt that she didn't have quite enough work to do, so the other days she worked as a volunteer at New England Sinai Rehab Hospital. She was sitting at her desk at work at Sears when the vision in her left eye went completely black. It didn't come back, but for about 3 minutes, and then it did. Perfectly fine again. So she said, whatever. But the next day, it happened again, and this time the vision did not come back. So she actually left work early, had her son come and get her. They called the physician. Her primary care doctor said, "Don't go home. Go directly to an emergency room." And that was how she ended up seeing us. In the emergency room, we suspected she was having a stroke, that she'd had a stroke, in fact, from a severe blockage that we found in her carotid artery in her neck. and she would need urgent surgery, therefore, in order to open the blockage. She was, a little unsure that this was something she wanted to do. She was 87 years old. She did not like the idea of surgery. She thought long and hard before ultimately agreeing to it. She had great fear of the risks of the operation and what they could take away from her life, just recovering from it. But she had greater fear of what her condition might take away, particularly if she would have another stroke, another episode, 2 in a matter of 2 successive days, most likely more to come and could be worse. And for her, being able to remain independent, to work, to contribute in some way was the most important thing to her. And her best chance of trying to preserve this was take her chances and to act. The operation went remarkably well. She didn't seem to have any problems at all. She was weak afterwards for a day or so. She ate the next morning. She got out of bed. She felt fine. We were concerned. She was a little older. She had to get used to the loss of vision in the eye. Often after carotid surgery, you can go home the very next day, but we kept her another day. And at that point, she seemed quite ready to leave. But she began complaining that next day of something that hadn't been there before, which was a severe constipation. She just was kind of feeling nauseated and uncomfortable, and where she'd been eating food before, now she stopped eating food. We tried some laxatives, and it did nothing. She said her belly it hurt. A young resident, seeing her, was the one who really figured out that something was not right. That, in fact, this would turn out to be not constipation, but a disaster from a strange, unexpected complication. Her stomach had twisted on itself, pulled up into her chest, and become trapped, a condition known as a gastric volvulus. Very odd thing after a neck operation. It would take some time, even weeks, to figure out that this probably was chronic. But something worse had happened, that with her stomach twisted and up in her chest, that she might have been that way for many decades, that she developed an ulcer out of the stress of the operation. And the ulcer had ruptured into her chest, where if it was down in your belly, not quite as terrible, still pretty bad. But here, rupturing into your chest because your stomach was up there where your lungs are. And that is a total catastrophe for any of you, let alone if you're 87 years old. The textbooks say it's up to an 80% fatality rate, so far as we've seen such situations before. Yet she did survive. She ended up leaving the hospital with her son within a week after this happened. And the more I've tried to reflect on how the story of how this was made possible, the more I've come to think it might be relevant to all of us, whomever we are, not just in medicine but beyond, but certainly for us in medicine as well. I came to surgery unexpectedly. It was not the field I thought I was going to go into in medicine. I'd worked in policy and other things and thought that the direction for me was going to be something like internal medicine or the like. But the first time I was in an operating room, I was completely enthralled. I thought it was, I liked the blood and guts. There was that. But I also liked surgeons, to my surprise, because sometimes they're not always the nicest people. But what I liked about surgeons, I think, was their competence, their combination of confidence and competence that they had. There were some vivid cases I remember from that first rotation. There was a prisoner who had been brought in who had sliced up his arm with a razor blade and then swallowed the razor blade. There was a teenager who had mono and had a rare complication of mono, all your lymph nodes swell, and your spleen is kind of a big lymph node, and his spleen had swelled and then ruptured in a football game, and ended up coming in shock, barely alive, from this ruptured, bleeding spleen. And a surgeon got him on the table and was able to get this spleen out all in about 10 minutes. It was an amazing thing to watch. And even just the routine stuff, you'd watch a patient who has attacks of gallstones, and now the surgeon would go in with laparoscopic surgery, and it looked to me like removing a gallbladder with chopsticks deep inside a person on this video monitor. And I thought the source of their competence and confidence came from their confidence in their physical skills, their hand-eye coordination, the fine motor capabilities. But as I entered residency and began training myself, I found out that that was not where the competence came from, or necessarily the confidence. Physical skills were important, and they do take some time to master and to practice along the way. But they turned out to be no harder to learn than the ones that Mrs. C had mastered as a seamstress. Instead, the critical skills of the best folks that I saw was their ability to handle complexity and to handle uncertainty. They were constantly making judgments under conditions of imperfect knowledge. They had mastery of teamwork, and that seemed to make a huge difference. And they also had a willingness to accept the consequences, to accept the responsibility for the consequences of their choices and whatever happened. And I think in this respect, what made the surgeons I admired really great at what they do is not necessarily different from what makes people great at what they do that you might admire in their life in teaching, in public service, in business, in whatever you might be doing. Everybody in our world now faces the difficulties of complexity and uncertainty. And that means we are all frequently risking failure. As a result, I think we're all forced to develop these critical capabilities: judgment, teamwork, and acceptance of responsibility for when things don't necessarily turn out right. One of the things that people always admonish us when we're starting out is, take risks, be willing to fail. And I've always thought that was a little odd. I mean, do you want a surgeon whose motto is, I like to take risks? We do want people to take risks. We want people to strive for difficult goals, even deal with the possibility of failure and accept it. We can't have progress otherwise. But how you deal with the risk of failure and failure itself is what I think turns out to matter. The key to reducing death after surgery was historically a progression of events. There was introduction of ways to reduce risks of things going wrong by the introduction of technologies, specialization, better planning along the way. For example, in 1847 was when anesthesia was discovered. And if you look at the history of how medicine ended up evolving, that surgery in particular evolving, that was a pivotal moment in how the field ended up developing. Up to that point, basically surgery had changed very gradually, only very slightly over the course of millennia. We were still using techniques, for example, for dealing with cataracts that were developed in the 6th century BC by an Indian surgeon named Sushruta, who used to take care of cataracts in the eye by taking a needle and pushing the lens into the back of the eye and out of the way as the means to take care of it. He developed the first techniques for opening the eye and pulling out the cataract if it absolutely had to come out as the only way to do it. No anesthesia capability. This was what you did. And you literally could find in the 1830s reports that were exactly the same, that was how little things had progressed. And then the discovery in 1847, that there was this gas called ether, that if you breathed it, made you insensible to pain, swept the world in a matter of weeks in 1847. It was so incredible to people, this idea that you could transform this field and you could undergo something like even an amputation and not even feel it. I mean, pain was a central part of life. And here you started to have this switch to take seriously the idea that this kind of suffering wasn't necessary, it wasn't laudable, it was something you could attack. The creation of laudanum and rediscovery of the properties of morphine and so on started to come into place. Those were the capabilities that started us down the road to the point that we were generating entirely new operations and new ways of doing things almost on a monthly basis for the next 80 years. During this time, you had the invention of more than 2,500 different kinds of surgical procedures, discovery of ways to make it safer using antisepsis, using bringing in gloves into operations. One of the interesting things is that every one of these changes were resisted in their own way. Anesthesia, for example, there were critics who said that it was a needless luxury. And surgeons would complain about having to wear gloves because you didn't have that feel of the intestine on your own skin, and how could you operate without that? Well, the result, however, has been an extraordinary transformation of this particular field. It wasn't so long ago that even in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you would still say just the anesthesia was more dangerous than the operation itself. And so surgery was so inherently dangerous, people felt that it was generally regarded as a last resort. But we've been able to find ways to reduce the risks along a whole panel of issues, serious infection, bleeding, and other deadly problems that we euphemistically call complications. But now surgery is so safe and routine, most of it is day surgery. You go home the same day. Now, despite all of that history, all of that capability that has been brought in, there are still huge differences in the results depending on where you go for your care. Huge differences in the outcomes of care depending on the hospitals that you go around and see. And some have, and when I say huge differences, I mean, for example, there are far higher death rates in some hospitals than others. And so there's evolved in the last couple of decades an interesting line of research asking why. The premise had been that if you just made the discoveries about how you reduce the risks in the first place, then the rising tide lifts all boats, and it did. Everything got better, but there were some places that still were markedly better than the others. And so in that time of research, researchers have actually discovered the answer. And it has a twist that I did not understand or expect at the start of my training. I thought that the best places were simply doing a better job at preventing things from going wrong. They were just better at minimizing the risks inherent in this kind of work. But to my surprise, the studies, the data, showed that they didn't do better at preventing things from going wrong. And yet they had very different death rates. Instead, while they might have nearly similar complication rates no matter what their death rate ultimately was. Instead, what the really great places proved to be great at was rescuing people, preventing the failure from becoming a catastrophe. The scientists gave a name to the deaths that occur after something goes wrong in surgery, after, for example, an infection, or after an ulcer and a twist in the stomach like this lady had. They called it a failure to rescue. A failure to rescue. And more than anything, that has turned out to be what distinguishes the great from the mediocre in that line of work. They did not necessarily fail less. They rescued more. And that may be, I think, the real story of human and societal improvement. We talk a lot about risk management, this nice hygienic corporate phrase. But some have a better capacity to prepare for disaster, limit the damage, and then sometimes retrieve success from failure. So it isn't willingness to fail. It may be willingness to rescue. There are, when things go wrong, three main pitfalls, three main ways that you fail to rescue. One way is you have the wrong plan for what to do in the face of the disaster. The second is you have an inadequate plan. And the third is you may have no plan at all. Let's say you're cooking, right? You've got some oil in a pan on the stove, and you set the pan on fire. Throwing gasoline on the fire, that would be the wrong plan. Leaning over, trying to blow out the fire, that would be an inadequate plan. And saying, fire? What fire? That would be no plan at all. So let's consider a real case. The British petroleum oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico 2 years ago. Every one of those failures happened. All three kinds of ways of dealing with disaster. And the result was the death of 11 men and 5 million barrels of oil spilled over 3 months into the Gulf of Mexico. The official investigation that occurred after pieced together the sequence of events. And those sequence events went back months before that disaster actually ever occurred. There were early signs that the drill pipe they were putting down was having problems and was improperly designed. This is attempting to do something that has started to feel like it's perfectly capable and routine, but drilling more than a mile underneath the surface of the ocean, down still further miles in order to tap into oil, is a extraordinary human feat with extraordinary complexity. And the investigations had suggested that the drill pipe was not necessarily going to be able to withstand certain kinds of pressures underneath. Now, the companies at that time that were involved didn't do anything about that. That can happen. But then, on the evening of April 20, 2010, during a routine test of the well, another thing that can happen happened, which is that the rig's crew ended up detecting an abnormality in the pressure of the drill pipe. You see pressures that jump up and down, and so, they weren't sure if this was just one of those ups and downs, or was this a real problem? And so they watched it. They took some more measurements. They decided they should take a different kind of measurement. And that also revealed that a number of other abnormalities that signaled what's called a kick had developed, an undetected pressure buildup in the drill pipe. And so the result was they just kept doing different kinds of test after test, saying, surely it can't be that. And so it was 2 hours before they recognized the seriousness of what they were up against. 2 hours that they had with no plan. Then, when they did recognize what the problem was. They sent the flow of everything that was building up in the pipe, they vented it in order to take the pressure off the pipe, but sent the flow through a piece of equipment that couldn't handle those kinds of pressures. The result was that the kick ended up becoming a blowout, and the mud gas mix that was vented out exploded. Emergency crews went into action. There was fire on the rig. But for 12 minutes, no one sounded a general alarm to abandon the rig. They thought this would be containable. And that was the final step that led directly to the death of 11 men in what came as a second explosion. As I said, there was every type of error that occurred in that BP oil disaster. But the key one was the delay in accepting that something serious was wrong. There were delays at every point along in simply recognizing that he needed to have a plan of some kind, better than none at all. You can see this in national policy too. Every policy courts failure, for example, our war in Iraq, but we refuse to even admit that things aren't going as expected, and when you do, failure becomes a humanitarian disaster. So what we find is that the sooner that we can see that our best hopes and intentions have gone awry, the better. It gives us more room to pivot, more room to adjust, and it's more of a chance to rescue, more of a chance to salvage success from failure. But recognizing that expectations have gone wrong, that what you thought was happening isn't what's happening, is, I think, the hardest thing to do. In order to have attempted this crazy thing in the first place, an operation on an 87-year-old, drilling a mile under the ocean, attempting a major national policy, you have to have confidence. You can't take risks without self-confidence. And you learn early on in surgery how essential that really is. That was what attracted me to surgery in the first place, remember? That here you had people who understood that their knowledge is imperfect, that their information that they're working from is never complete, that the science can never be certain, and that your skills, individually as a person, will never be infallible. And yet, you must act. You must act because failure to act, failure to do anything at all, is often worse than attempting something in the face of uncertainty. And so you cannot let yourself become paralyzed by fear. Now, on the flip side, we have the struggle with the fact that there is value to perseverance. There's value to plugging ahead despite obstacles. But it's not blind perseverance. You have to prepare for failure in the face of understanding that you're plowing ahead through obstacles. Indeed, I would say that part of perseverance is the planning for when things go wrong. And only then do you find that success ends up being possible. When Mrs. C ended up having her abdominal pain turn to catastrophe, for instance, my colleagues at my hospital were prepared. Now, they were not prepared for anything so odd as the idea that her stomach had turned out to be congenitally wound and trapped in her chest, like a balloon twisted too tight. In fact, when the resident first brought the news that he was just concerned that something was really wrong, he brought it to the surgeon who'd done the operation, the attending surgeon, and the surgeon thought he was just being alarmist. Just the day before, she'd been doing great, right? She'd been up, she'd been eating, she'd been doing well. And what could, she's complaining of abdominal pain. What could possibly be going wrong in a belly after neck surgery? He'd never seen it. Never seen anything like that happen in someone who'd had neck surgery, but he'd seen plenty of constipation. So this must be constipation. But he was humble enough to understand that he could see something that goes wrong. And so he listened. You never know where trouble strikes. He let the resident order the scan that he was pressing to order in order to understand what was going on. Maybe it would show nothing. The team made sure that it was expedited, because if the concern was something disastrous, you needed to move it along and move it to the head of the queue, even though, what's the likelihood? But when it showed not just the unexpected twist, but the fact that there was what we call free air in the chest. That means air that had escaped from the stomach and bowel and was now around the stomach and bowel, only in this case, up in the chest. Well, at that point, then, no one dismissed it. They immediately called for help from another surgeon, a chest surgeon, and the patient was on the operating table within an hour and a half. It did not go exactly perfectly. They fumbled around for a long time. They were trying to sort out exactly what was going on. You had the images, but it was such an unusual situation that it wasn't clear what this picture was. What they hoped for, because you have an elderly person who is not that strong, and you were hoping that you weren't going to have to do some kind of massive operation. They decided at first to just use scopes, to put a scope down into her stomach and try to look around and see what could be done that way without any kind of a major operation. And that cost them some time. It was an inadequate plan. It was even potentially the completely wrong plan. But they avoided the worst mistake, which was having no plan at all. And they had acted early enough that they bought time for trial and error, for learning through the situation. They could figure out all of the steps to get her through. And that was what gave her the chance for rescuing success from failure. It was a long operation, but they had gotten started early enough that she made it through. I spoke to Mrs. C a few months later. She was living with her son. At that point, she had turned 88. The vision had now gone permanently from her left eye. It had not come back. And that meant, to her great lament, that she could not drive. And worse, she couldn't work. And she really missed both. "I'm not the same person I used to be," she said. She doesn't like being dependent on others, even just for a ride to go somewhere. So I asked her, I said, "Are you glad that we did this? We put you through all of the recovery that you had to go through from this big operation. You'd had doubts about whether you wanted just the neck operation with a couple days of recovery. Her recovery after this operation involved a couple weeks in rehabilitation, getting strength back, all of those kinds of things. So are you glad?" What kind of question is that? Of course I'm glad. She was leading life on her own, she said. She has family, especially grandchildren. She was looking again for opportunities to volunteer. Life is not perfect, but it is good, she said. And that is the rescue of success from failure. It's not perfection, but it's better than she had. I got a chance to get to know the person who came up originally with this idea called failure to rescue. It's a physician at the University of Pennsylvania named Jeffrey Silber, who was not even a surgeon at all. He's a pediatrician. And so when he coined the idea and then actually studied it in surgery, who's this pediatrician talking about what happens in how we get our job done in surgery? I mean, this is crazy. So it was 2 decades until it really became broadly accepted. But there have now been multiple studies confirming the insight that he had. His idea, though, is still more radical than we've been quite ready to accept. He said to me, suppose you have a choice of 2 hospitals for surgery, and they both have the same death rate, but they get the same death rate by achieving it in different ways. In Hospital 1, they have fewer complications in the first place, according to their data for how they got that death rate. So they have fewer complications that would lead to death. In the other hospital, they have more complications, but they're better at rescuing people from those complications. And the result is the same death rate. Now, my question for you is, which hospital would you want? Hospital 1, fewer complications, same death rate. Hospital 2, more complications, but we rescue you better, and you have to achieve that death rate. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many people, you get your little Consumer Reports telling you that this story is the case, how many people want Hospital 1? How many people want Hospital 2? Oh, so you know which way this is going. I got more votes for Hospital 2. I would have picked Hospital 1. I mean, I'm talking to this guy, he's asking me. I'm like, Hospital 1, are you kidding? I want the place that has fewer complications. I made a whole career out of making a checklist to reduce your likelihood you're going to have those complications. And I really believed that I was lowering that capability in the first place, right? So I picked Hospital 1. But what he pointed out, and then I went through the data, and he was right, is that you want Hospital 2, the one with more complications. And it's completely counterintuitive, but here is the argument. The likelihood that something goes wrong in any given year with a patient in a hospital undergoing surgery depends far more on circumstances, how poor they are, how obese that population is, how unhealthy people are going into the operation in the first place. That there are factors that matter in the hospital, like whether you use the checklist and so on, but your complication rate as a hospital in that year is much more dependent on chance in the world. It's like life that way. Life going in has so many complexities that although you prepare, it's some of it, a good deal of it, and turns out in medicine, is not in your hands. It depends more on the circumstances than on the skill of the team. But the likelihood that people survive when something goes wrong is far more dependent on how good the surgical team is than necessarily their health to begin with, because the health had made the likelihood of complications occur. And that's why he says that you want the hospital number 2. You have a place that demonstrated that whatever is happening with their complications, they have a much lower failure to rescue rate, a much greater ability to rescue, and that is a better indicator of their skill as a group of people than necessarily what their entry numbers turn out to be. Under conditions of complexity, the ability to salvage success from failure is the best indicator of your overall ability in whatever you do, he argues. This has enormous implications. If we think about how do you want to foster a world where we have more success in response to failure, how would you do it? Well, think about what happened after the BP oil disaster. Our strategy there has been, well, we want to regulate it and we want to require it. And the complicating factor is this place was already under regulations to actually make it happen, that they have protocols in place for how to deal with these kinds of situations. What they had was the appearance of preparation for disaster rather than actual preparation for disaster. And so the requirements lead to something that I see happen in medicine and many lines of work all the time, which is teaching to the test, learning how to to get by, knowing how to play the game in order to meet all of the requirements, without ever quite getting the idea behind it. So in medicine, we've been trying a different approach. We call it pay for performance. And the concept there is that if you do it in a more positive way, people will go along. Some of my work is not on the writing side with the New Yorker, but on the research side, understanding how we make systems of care that actually are better. And so I worked with colleagues in the Washington State Hospital Association, and they did an experiment in which we went to the insurers in the state and the governor to give incentives for hospitals to adopt the surgical checklist that we had devised. And in fact, we then had gone on to do some further work developing checklists for how to handle crisis situations in surgery, and have recently shown that you dramatically improve your ability to rescue people from failure if you have these preparations of simple ways you deal with everything from a heart attack, if you should face it in an operating room, to massive blood loss, to unexpected diagnoses. What we did then at the end of the year is went back and looked at those hospitals, and it turned out by the end of the year, 100% of the hospitals were getting the pay-for-performance payments. They had documented and certified that they were doing these very things. We then interviewed people and visited hospitals, picked out 5 at random, and what we found was just 2 out of 5 were actually doing it. The 2 out of 5 were doing it phenomenally. They were, they had their whole way of practicing had been transformed. But in 3 out of 5, they had lots of documentation that stuff was happening, but no actual change in what was happening. It was pay for paperwork, not pay for performance. And that is a story that occurs over and over and over again, is that whether it's penalties or payments, they don't necessarily change what people do and what people feel and how they imagine for themselves what there is. So then in the last year and a half, we've had an experiment with the state of South Carolina. This time we hooked up with the South Carolina Hospital Association and said, how can we make this kind of work happen in every hospital in the state of South Carolina? And this time we didn't pay them, and we didn't put in regulations. Instead, what we did was we introduced transparency. We introduced the idea that we would simply show all of the hospitals what standards existed across their hospitals, and then offered them training programs in how to get improvement in where they stand with those standards. And we applied some pressure. We asked every CEO in the state to sign up their hospital to this program, and then we advertised the ones that didn't. And within about 3 months, we had every CEO in the state. And then we had them appoint a team that had a surgeon, an anesthesiologist, a nurse, and a member of their executive team who would agree to work together to make these changes occur. And we asked them to participate in a hour-long, basically, teleconference call, a webinar of walking through with each one another how they went through trying to implement a program like this. We're now about a year into it. It's still too early to say how it's gone, but we've seen the first state where there's been, for 2 successive quarters, a reduction in infections in hospitals, where before it had gone up. We don't know yet what the death rate would do. And what we also have seen from our mystery visits is that where it was typically anywhere from a third or so of hospitals you had actual participation, we now have seen that these kinds of practices have become routine for about 2/3 of the patients in the state undergoing surgery. Why would transparency work where payments or penalties wouldn't? And I think the core of it is that any of these can work, but what is holding everyone back from trying any of these kinds of ideas is culture. What is culture? One of my colleagues, a geriatrician named Bill Thomas, gave me a formula for culture that I think is a pretty good one. He said, culture is the sum total of habit and expectation. And our habits and expectations, our norms, are that these aren't the ways that we normally do what we do, that we don't expect failure, we don't have the humility to believe in it, we don't prepare for it because we don't have the teamwork and the discipline to do it. It's not our culture. It's not our habit. It's not our expectation. And transparency, the recognition that there are some people who have made it their habit and expectation, ends up being fundamentally important. A payment doesn't change culture, although if you lose money for following the good norms and expectations, you can easily destroy a good culture. Regulation and penalty doesn't make it happen, although if you can punish the worst forms of a culture, you can make transformation. But at the center of it, I think the reason why transparency turns out to be powerful in our lines of work, seeing what other people do, understanding the fabric of what people's lives and practices are like, that transparency ends up fundamentally powerful because it is it draws and affects that culture. And that's why it ended up being in this line of work that I'm in, telling stories as well as doing research. The power of a place like the New Yorker or media or data comes from being able to understand that habit and expectation are driven by much more than whether we are being paid or penalized in various different ways. It comes from what we end up understanding to be our norms, and the stories of where our norms are, I think, are deeply important. And when you combine that with the idea that societal progress comes from the ability to rescue yourself from failure, not from risking failure, but from being able to act when there's failure, I think that ends up being an important concept to put together and to combine. And it's important because it means that there's work to do after there's failure. And we who tell the stories about what happens when there's failure, I don't think we necessarily get these ideas right. We wanted to string up BP by its toes, and that is partly the right thing to do because it sets a new understanding about what the norms and expectations are. But we did very little investigating or explanation about why the failure occurred after why success was not rescued from failure afterwards. A great deal of focus on the personalities of the people at the top of BP, but they're detailed in a report that got very little attention was exactly the human drama of how, step after step, you watched 11 people die and where that moment might have come from. Now, why does that happen? I think because we haven't yet grasped this idea of grasping failure from rescue. Instead, we're in a very particular moment in our society where vitriol about failure is our major line of attack. And what you need when there's failure is room to admit that there is failure and then try to act. Why does a politician refuse to admit mistakes? Because to admit a mistake is the end of the story. We think these people have to go. What an idiot. Out of there. Why do doctors find it incredibly difficult to admit a mistake? Because we see it as a fundamentally shameful thing that we have for many decades been expected to be kind of infallible, almost like gods, right? And entering this period now where we admit when there's failure, acknowledge, tell you, I made a mistake, only works because what we follow it with is another sentence. And here's what I'm going to try to do to help make it right. But that only happens if we give the room for that possibility to even happen, to allow there to be a chance for rescue. This goes deeper, I think, into our lives itself. Most of life is taking chances on a new job, trying out a new idea, trying a new relationship. And we go in with great hopes. But things won't always go right. Not in the least, will they? When I graduated from college, I thought I would try to become a philosopher. I went abroad to study and ended up finding I was a profoundly mediocre philosopher. I had a hard time understanding the questions the professors were asking, let alone how to answer them in any kind of a novel way. So later I tried having a rock band. And I wrote the most awful songs. One song, for example, compared my love for a girl to the decline of Marxism. After this, I went to work in politics. Ended up working on the Clinton campaign staff on healthcare legislation, ultimately won, went into working in the White House, and then healthcare legislation went nowhere. It was the healthcare reform debacle, they called it, and it was a debacle. It set back the prospects of achieving universal coverage by almost 2 decades. But the worst failure is the failure to rescue something. And part of the beauty of being in our particular country is that I was allowed to rescue, to find a way to rescue success from failure. And so I took away ideas and experiences and relationships with people, I think, that profoundly changed what I was able to do when I finally found the place that was for me, which was in medicine and unexpectedly in writing. So we each take risks, we each have failures, but it's what happens afterwards that is defining. A failure may not have to be a failure at all, but you have to be ready for it. Will you admit when things go wrong? Will you have steps that you understand you can take to set them right? Because the difference between triumph and defeat isn't about willingness to take risks. It's about mastery of rescue. Thank you. We have some microphones up front, and you're welcome to come for questions if you have any on this or other things I might have thrown into the New Yorker of late. Why don't we start over here?
Thank you very much. So I work in the private sector, and so it's not likely we will be able to compare across corporations measures like mortality and other things. But this is a compelling idea inside of many organizations, as you point out. And so I'm asking a simple question. Has this work been published? I mean, either you or I could turn it into a PowerPoint, which is what I need to explain it to people.
So a short version of this I gave as a commencement address at Williams College this past year, and then put on the New Yorker online under the title Failure and Rescue. So since it didn't get into the print pages, I had the chance to try to tell you all here. And but you can find it online as well. And it has the references in there in case you're interested in the studies behind some of this stuff.
Hi, I'd like to know what you think is the connection between writing and medicine. Because many times when I'm editing, I feel like I'm undergoing a hernia surgery or something like that.
That when you're being edited?
Yes.
It is like undergoing surgery. I think I'm fascinated by the connections between medicine and writing. There are a lot of great medical writers. I mean, some of the people that I feel that I love the most are people like Anton Chekhov, Walker Percy, people who are physicians, were physicians who then turned to writing. And there's I think Ruskin was the one who said that artists and physicians have a certain thing in common, which is that when someone falls on the street, passes out, that the job of the artist and the physician is to notice the particular color of blue their lips have turned, and not just have concern about what might have happened to them. And I think that there is a certain quality in both art and in medicine of needing to see detail and understand and be an observer and step back a little bit from the immediacy of what's going on. I think also in writing in particular, it's a fit with certain skills that are encouraged in medicine, which is to step into other people's shoes and to be able to do that. More and more medical schools, in fact, are now having students write the stories of patients. I'd be very interested to see if it actually works as a way to cultivate this kind of way of thinking. I don't know how much it's teachable to be able to step into other people's shoes and see through their eyes. But what they ask them to do is actually follow a patient through the whole medical process and then write the story of what their experience is from their point of view, instead of from the point of view that they always have as you're going through training, which is just seeing it, as this person who is waking you up at 2 a.m. So I think there are some interesting and deep connections, but yes, being edited is like going through surgery without anesthesia.
Have you ever had the experience yourself or talked to a doctor who's had to say to a patient, yeah, I made a mistake, but here's what I'm going to do? And I ask that because, you mentioned how in politics admitting failure might be the end of the story, but I think with certain kinds of officials, at least, on the rare occasion when someone actually admits some imperfection, people respond, surprisingly well, right? And then, if people get over the hump of admitting failure the first time, do they say, oh, wow, that went better than I thought, or is it really the end of the story?
Well, there's risk. You have no guarantee about how people are going to react. And that's part of what makes an apology work, right? There is risk in it. And if it was, I think we can read when a politician or a doctor is saying sorry because they have to. And when they, admit that a mistake was made, that's why we dissect the phrasing and the, exactly whether it was real or not real. And I think that ends up being fundamentally important to people because where their heart is coming from, whether they are genuinely sorry, whether there is an apology at the heart of it, is a very important part of this transaction for people. We have trusted you as a doctor, or you as a public official, or you as anybody we turn to help with something. And that trust rests on your having good intentions, the intentions that we hoped that you would have. And when there is failure, the apology is a way of saying, my intentions, though, were still the same and were good. Now, I've apologized to patients. I do about a couple hundred operations a year, and a complication rate of 4% or so means that I have about 8 people a year who I make markedly worse, if not kill, in the course of a year. And those 8 people weigh a heck of a lot heavier on me than the 192 that might do well. And when I will say, that I'm really sorry that this complication happened, and here's what we're going to do. I've seen all kinds of reactions. People who don't trust me anymore and want to find another physician, and I'm happy to help arrange it. The goal is still the same. Let's get you through this. But I'm shocked at how often, it just happened a couple of weeks ago, that the patient said thank you. And I was embarrassed to be like, you know, I didn't actually solve your problem. I made you worse. And they still felt that they could say thank you. I think I don't completely understand it, but I think it's an important part of the phenomenon.
It seems that so many doctors practice with fear of lawyers. Do these changes in culture, do you think, overcome that when you can only affect one side but not the other? That is, you affect the doctors but not the lawyers that are glad to come after them.
Yeah. So I have written about how I think the medical malpractice system is a shambles. We have a large amount of money going through the system. Only 1% of patients who have serious negligent harm happen to them ever see financial benefit that comes out of it. That on the one hand, the people who are harmed aren't helped very often, and then about a third to a half of those cases that do go through involve no harm and are genuinely frivolous according to the data.
Is that because they mostly don't know that they were harmed?
Yes, so you get this interesting combination that you have large number of people who feel that, who may not know they're harmed, but we've seen an interesting experiment that's evolved over time. So while I believe that we ought to change the malpractice system, I can go into detail about, I've written about this, so there's a New Yorker article I could refer you to, that there are ways to make it better, that there have been a great deal of work done in places that have simply attacked the fact that most people don't realize harm was done to them, and they have accelerated disclosure and apology to patients, and reaching an early offer to pay for and compensate for those costs. The University of Michigan has done this. They've done it at, I believe it's the University of Kentucky and other places. And those programs have been phenomenally successful. They've markedly improved satisfaction that people have. The number of patients who are harmed that get benefit through that kind of system have gone up, and the total costs of the system have gone down along the way. So I don't think, not just because of those programs, but for a variety of reasons, I don't think that although malpractice concerns can be a barrier along the way, I don't think that they are a true obstacle. That in all the work that we've been doing around managing and dealing with errors and understanding how to attack them, I think our fears of the malpractice lawsuits have done more damage than the actual suits themselves, and stopped us from trying to solve problems.
So this is perhaps a direct follow-up. You speak about making the room to be able to openly discuss failures and beyond that to rescue, and what do we do about it? Assuming there is no tort reform, how can we help to begin to shift the mindsets and behaviors of physicians and physicians in training to make them feel open to really making their decisions without that fear?
Well, I don't think this is exclusive to medicine. So, the specter of either legal response or regulatory response can be handled in one of two ways. Either you decide that we're victims of this situation, and therefore we will move down a path that just feels like it's the wrong thing, or we carve our way forward towards doing the right thing, and then using our cases where we're blocked as our way of pushing ahead. How do I make that a little more articulate? That was a little bit mumbly. So the best way I can think about it is that when we have put in, well, here's a good example. We went to our malpractice insurer in our area and said, how do we do what happened in the fire industry? So, and in fire, putting sprinklers into buildings was something that was proven to be extremely effective in rescuing a disaster from a fire. So the trouble was telling everywhere around the country that they had to, as a regulatory matter, install sprinklers in buildings ended up being a huge, engendering a huge backlash. And so the ultimate driver of what put sprinklers and fire extinguishers into buildings was that home insurance ended up being differentiated over, and building insurance over whether you had these or you didn't. And you could get a 40% discount by putting these systems in place, and that turned out to be a significant enough payoff that it didn't pay remotely for the whole cost of these things, but it was a push in the right direction enough that the norms changed. So we worked with our malpractice insurer to do the same thing. We said that if physicians trained to take this training program in how to implement these kinds of protocols and so on, then would they give the discount, give a discount for being able to do that? And in fact, they ended up putting in a 10% discount as part of the incentive to drive people into giving a shot at trying these new ways of doing things. And lo and behold, it actually paid off. They found over time, not from our program, but a prior version of it, that which was with obstetrics, which is the most sued field by far, that the safety of the delivery of care had improved so much by putting in approaches to improve rescue when things go wrong, that they were able to make even bigger discounts. And our malpractice insurer in our area now has the lowest costs of obstetric malpractice premiums in the country. So I think there are ways of being able to tackle what feels like the barrier of there's not going to be tort reform coming or major liability change, but one way you can reduce those costs and also the harm is just by trying to minimize the damage done.
Did that have an impact on the fear of those physicians practicing?
Fear of being sued? No. People still complain.
Hi, so a lot of your writing has focused on the sort of broader conversations around medicine and health, and also the need for physicians to step out of their traditional niche and play a role in defining these new revolutions. So I sort of noticed a curious trend. Back when the Declaration of Independence was signed, about 10% of the people that signed it were physicians. When Congress passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, about 3% of the people in Congress were physicians. And of the 16 physicians in Congress, 15 of them voted against it. Only one voted for it. So my question to you is, do you think there's an underrepresentation of physicians pushing for progressive reform in the political sector in the United States? And secondly, could you ever see yourself, or do you see yourself contemplating direct public or elected public office to help steer these conversations?
Let me answer that first one, or that other one. No. I feel incredibly lucky to have the place I've got, which is being able to tell stories that feel like right now there aren't a lot of other people who, I'm a little baffled by it. You have an entire industry of healthcare writing and journalists and so on who focus on inside the Beltway in Washington, when the change that's actually happening is in what happens and how different the world is of what happens when a patient actually sees a doctor in an office. And it's not the same as it was 10 years ago, and it's not the same as it's even going to be 5 years from now. And that experience is changing radically no matter what happens in Washington. I feel like that's something that's missing, and in many ways will be more influential than what happens in politics. In some ways, politics can lead, and on values like trying to make sure that everybody in the country actually has insurance, and whether that's something that people will fight for, I think that politics has to lead from those kinds of areas. On other areas about whether healthcare actually works for people, whether helping professions in general work for people, I don't think that Washington will be the leader of whether our schools work. I don't think Washington will be the leader of whether healthcare is there and works for you when you need it. I don't think it's the leader of whether police work works the right way. I think it's the practitioners themselves, the people who are being tried to, we are trying to help, working together with lots of other folks that end up making the difference. An example. The discovery of a drug or a new device, those were revolutionary things in the last century. And we've just come through this century of the molecule. But I think we've entered the century of the system. And the ways in which all of those drugs, devices, and specialists actually work together ends up being extremely powerful, to the point that I think that they will be more powerful than any one of those drugs or devices in their ability to reduce harm or improve cost. And that means that the people who do that work of knitting systems together cannot exclude the patient or the physician. Let me try to put it a little more succinctly. That if you have a world that physicians don't take an interest in changing what we do. I was chatting with a group earlier outside, and we were talking about the idea that a physician, in order to get information, gets it all from faxes. We're the last industry that still uses faxes in the country. The average physician receives 1,100 faxes a month. Fax machines wouldn't exist if not for the healthcare industry still being there. And the fact that physicians have taken almost no interest in figuring out how to get rid of fax machines and work with information technology companies and other folks is symptomatic of deciding that someone else out there is going to solve this. But fixing that problem, so information that's critical to saving people's lives ends up in your hands more effectively than waiting around for faxes, will save more lives than any drug or device that we've currently got. And if clinicians don't take responsibility for doing that, I don't think any software engineer on the outside or government official will be able to do anything that changes that. So I think there is a place for the medical community to be involved in politics. But I also think that at the largest level, it's believing that part of our job is discovery of what will make people's lives better and trying to be as innovative as we can in how to do that. Yes?
The pilot landed his airplane in the Hudson River, said, "I didn't do anything special. This is something I train to do all the time." So I think that to make people better at rescuing from catastrophe, it really is a good idea to make them train with hopefully simulated catastrophes. But personally, I mean, actually go through it.
Yeah. Sully Sullenberger, the captain on that, I actually got to write about it a little bit. The fascinating thing to me was our public reaction to when Sully was put in front of the cameras after the miracle of the rescue on the Hudson. And he said that he was hailed as a hero. You know, we said this is the miracle on the Hudson was this hero, and he kept saying it was procedure and protocol that saved the lives of those folks. And it became this either-or argument. Was it the checklists that they followed that saved him, or was it this man? And the fascinating thing was it's clearly both. So the training that they went through meant that when they were sitting on the runway in LaGuardia before taking off, he and Jeff Skiles, his co-pilot, ran through a series of checks, including asking themselves the question, what would we do if the engines went out on this flight? Now, they had, each of them, more than 25 years of flying experience between them. Not between them, each had 25 years of experience and never had the engines go out on them. But they still asked themselves that question on that runway before they took off and knew who would take over what responsibility when the geese hit the fan. And so the result was when at 3,000 feet they lost both engines, they could swiftly assign. Skiles was going to run through the protocols for how to restart the engines, the most life-saving thing to do. Sully would get on the radio and handle the piloting of the aircraft and location of an airport where they might be able to land it. And that meant they didn't have to think about any of the other stuff, any of the dumb stuff, and they could focus on the one question that there was no recipe, there was no protocol for. Where am I going to put this plane? And so his brain could focus on where it actually was the most life-saving. And I think that's the lesson coming out of many of these ideas, that under conditions of complexity, you need to reduce the brain load of what there is, be able to have certain kinds of discipline standards and ideas that we put in place, but leave the flexibility that people at the front can get the dumb stuff out of the way and put in that human part, which is the brilliant idea, where do you put your plane?
To some extent, as I was listening, I was hearing sort of an inversion of the old idiom about an ounce of prevention and a pound of cure. And it seemed like as you went on, you explained perhaps that that's not so much wrong in theory, but turns out wrong in practice because of the systems on which that sort of depends to implement that. And in your BP analogy, I'm trying to understand how this is applicable more broadly. And of course, there wasn't just 11 men who died on the rig. It was an ecosystem and a economy that depended on that. And then I'm thinking of other crises like the financial crisis and ways we can apply what you just said. So I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit about how this meets with systems where the downside risk is so great and the precautionary principle more generally.
Yeah, so what you're bringing up is there are some kinds of disasters from which there is no rescue, at the most extreme nuclear war. So you don't have a great plan for, okay, if we have 1,000 ballistic missiles going this way and 1,000 going that way, then how do we deal with that? It's prevention up front. And one of the core questions about BP that gets raised is, can we drill that deep under the water? What are the circumstances where the risks become ones where we're not willing to accept the possibility of failure? But most of life is having to deal with and expect that you've got some possibility of failure. And if we've decided that we are going to drill that far under the ocean, then there is the matters of prevention, but we have to be able to have the understanding that this is nature. You're dealing with powerful forces in the ocean and limited engineering knowledge that's always going to have holes in it. And so you want to be able to have the possibility of rescue. And that means being willing to plan and make a culture that can work on that rig, and in a larger sense, learn from that kind of lesson to apply it elsewhere. One of the things that I think is interesting that did happen out of that was the recognition that on oil rigs of many kinds, being able to deal with escalation of these kinds of situations doesn't actually, so there's regulations, but very little knowledge of how people rescue rig disasters. And so people from ExxonMobil came to my office to plot out, hey, when you made these checklists for surgery, how did you do that? And ended up applying it into how they handle disasters on oil rigs. That set of capabilities can, I think, potentially develop. But the ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure, there are some things that we will do where we would say, look, that risk is not worth taking.
Thank you for your presentation earlier. How do you think the role of cost within this strategy of preparing for disaster will affect utilizing these types of strategy versus the prevention strategies tend to be a lot less expensive, so it's a more manageable thing to talk about and discuss and create policy?
Well, so when we take it at the larger level and understand that people and their lives are kind of walking disasters, that all of us in the course of our life will reach points where we will have many things go wrong. And it's especially true, in the last 2 years of life, the average patient has more than 10 specialists involved. They are watching the processes of their own body and dealing with those breakdowns along the way. And what we have is a situation in which our system is neither made for prevention or dealing with these crises very well. We have a 20-minute office visit, or else send you to an ER to deal with these problems. And if any of you taken care of an elderly parent like I have recently with multiple range of problems, it makes you want to tear your hair out how incapable the system is, our doctors are, of being able to either make a plan in the first place for how to manage together, and then how to be able to deal when the plans don't necessarily turn out the way that you expect. I think the revolution of healthcare that's happening right now is related to an article I wrote a couple years ago called Hotspotting, about the changes in primary care in Camden, New Jersey, where what they did was they mapped out where the highest cost patients in the city was. It's a physician named Jeff Brenner. And what Jeff, this family physician, recognized was the most expensive patients on that map were the sickest patients. That's why they were the most expensive. And the second thing he observed is they are probably getting the worst care. And every time they looked at that in detail, it was absolutely true that those patients were falling between the cracks. They had many medications that don't necessarily fit together. The doctors weren't talking to one another. Their safety net was an emergency room, which was hardly a place to rescue success from failure. And that when they actually put a team around people who could articulate what are the goals for someone who is 560 pounds, severe diabetes, one operation after another, and congestive heart failure, what are the goals that we as a team of a dozen specialists could actually accomplish with this person, and then walk our way through trying to accomplish it. And I gave that example in the story. It seems like an impossible situation. This man was also an alcohol and cocaine addict, and costing $3 million a year. In the course of his care, they were able to reduce his costs more than 60%, rescue him from disasters much more successfully, and empower him enough by being able to solve defined problems that he went from practically living in hospitals. He spent more than 7 out of 12 months of the year in hospitals to less than 2 to 3 weeks in a hospital in a year, which for him is incredible victory and an incredible reduction in costs. So I think these things hugely go hand in hand when you understand that a patient is a person who has many potential areas of their life where things can go wrong, and a system that does not fit for being able to help them along the way. Last question, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Dr. Gawande.
And I apologize to those who are already in line.
Coming to speak with us. Just to comment on that story you just told, that article in the New Yorker about hotspotting, it actually inspired me to come to Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. That was one of the...
You just made my day.
Yeah, and I'm actually going down to Trenton to meet with him to learn more about it, because I think this is such a powerful article. But my question actually related to art and medicine. You were talking about how you combine them both in your training and cultivated them both. And I'm actually, I like to tell stories as well, but through documentary film. So my question as a second-year med student, I thought I would be able to kind of, do both. But one has kind of fallen by the wayside. You can guess which one that was. So my question is there a way to kind of balance these interests and have them, play off each other and throughout training and residency and beyond?
Well, no. There is no balance. So if you're trying to accomplish something especially when it's combining different fields. You don't get very far if you're combining the worst of one field and poor performance in one field with poor performance in the other field. And the sadness of it is you're working with people who, there are really great documentary people in the world and there are really great physicians in the world. And trying to put the two of them together means your life is not necessarily, it can be a little intense. But I think there are two ways to think about it. One is either you need to be sane, and you therefore build a community of people who include people from the documentary world and people from the MD world, and you get to be the glue that brings them together and allows this to develop. And so the fascinating idea is finding an artist or a documentary person from that world and pulling them in, and that allows you to stay in because that's what you need for sanity. Or you do what I do, is you just try to get really good at both, and you kill your family who's here today, and you make sacrifices, but you do it because if you want to make a difference, there is no balance. It's just the way that you have to go. You find your own ways of making satisfaction and dealing with the reality that there is no balance when you're aiming for a goal. There's just trying to get there. But that said, there are many avenues to getting there. I'm finding myself on the research side because I can't do all this research and writing and surgery, and I found myself caring a great deal about running these projects and systems and things like that, is I'm taking the club approach, taking lots of interesting people from information technology and from economics and from healthcare and running this almost like a salon where all my goal is to bring people together who know lots of stuff that I will never master and get them to work together. And I get to have the fun of learning a little bit from each of them, being an amateur in each of those worlds. Whereas in writing, I really am trying to compete with Adam Gopnik. I will never catch up with Adam Gopnik and his ability to put a paragraph together. But God knows I'm going to keep on trying. Thank you to everybody.